So I did want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Erica Lundstedt, and I am the Global Education Manager here at the World Affairs Council of Cincinnati in Northern Kentucky. I joined the council back in September. And before that, I spent time as a high school social studies teacher. And in my career, I taught a variety of social studies subjects. I taught economics, I taught AP histories, you name it, I pretty much taught it in social studies. So a lot of things that we'll be looking at from the inquiry perspective will have a social studies lens to it. But I really want to challenge your idea that inquiry is just for social studies, because I think it's something that you can use in a lot of different interdisciplinary ways. And so I'm excited to see what you guys come up with after this webinar and presentation. And so some other housekeeping things that I wanted to remind folks of. You are free to join the chat and introduce yourself and submit any questions that you have. You can do so there in the chat, but you can also use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And that way we can upvote the questions and make sure that they get answered in one nice central location. So if you can help me out by putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, I appreciate that. And then we'll also have some polls along the way, because I think it's nice to get a perspective on where everyone is in their inquiry journey. There's no right place to be in terms of your inquiry journey. And so there will be some opportunities for you to participate in polls, and those will pop up on your screen here in Zoom as well. So we're really great to have you here for our first webinar in the Skills for Students Future in the World series. We're focusing a lot on different global competency skills, no matter the discipline that we want students to have by the time they graduate, so that they can be successful in the world. So inquiry is going to be the one that we start with here in January. Great. So just a few objectives for our session today. These are the 4 things that I'd like you to be able to identify by the time that we are done today, or if you take some time to kind of reflect upon this session later on, if you want to rewatch it. We want to make sure that we know the definition of inquiry-based learning and how we can develop a rationale for how it contributes specifically to global competency. And I'll be talking about that here soon. We'll look at the difference between guided inquiry and direct inquiry and decide which is going to be most appropriate for your particular students and discipline. Some of the methods that we talk about, like IDM or QFT, might have a particular preference of one over another, but some terminology, and we use a lot of terminology in education here, it might make more sense for your specific discipline to look at it versus a guided or direct approach. So we'll talk about that and what makes the most sense for you. We're going to look at some resources that you can use for developing inquiry-based lessons in your subject area. So there are a couple kind of mainstays in terms of the types of inquiry-based learning, IDM and QFT, that you can go to for resources, but we'll also talk about the other things that you need to make inquiry lessons, and a lot of that is good sources, so images, primary sources, things like that, and where should we go to look for those things. And then especially those of you who would like to earn CEU or contact hours from this presentation, I'd really like you to start thinking about something that you would like to make inquiry-based in your classroom. So if there's a particular topic that you feel like you need to jazz up a little bit in your classroom, or really lends itself to exploration of different questions by students, start to think about what that topic might be. And then when we talk about different question types, compelling and supporting questions, start to think about what questions you might come up with. And so those of you who are interested in CEUs, you'll get a separate survey that will ask for you to reflect on these things personally. So it's always good to think about it ahead of time before you get to that CEU reflection. All right. And with that, I did want to get everyone's general consensus on how we feel about inquiry learning. So I'm going to launch a poll here in a moment, and I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about your inquiry experience. So what is your experience with inquiry-based learning? So a couple different options here. One, you use it all the time and you could teach this to other folks. We've got some folks who that applies to here. That looks great. You're familiar with it, but you feel like you don't implement it as often as you want to. You're familiar with it, but you've never tried inquiry methods in the past, or this is brand new to me and I really need to learn as much as possible. We've got a few folks that have used IDM regularly, which is great. And then a lot of us, this might be brand new to, or, we know what it is, but we don't have a really consistent way to use it in the classroom. So those are all great places to be. And we don't need to be perfect on our inquiry journey when we first start out. So that's a good place to be. So I'm really glad everyone's with us today. All right. So we're going to get started with just kind of a quick overview of what inquiry-based learning is. And I want to preface this by saying that it is not one of the particular methods that we'll be talking about. So a lot of times in the education space, we hear this is the method and there are particular resources we have to use with it. And there's research that went into it and it's so-and-so's method. I want to challenge that by saying that, we can do inquiry in a lot of different subjects. And it's really important that we use the word inquiry kind of free of some of that educational jargon sometimes. Inquiry in general is just the act of asking for information or investigating something. And we do that all the time. We just don't give it a capital I inquiry label. And so sometimes I think students, if it's not the method and it's very formulaic, will say, well, like, oh, I don't do that in other classes. But when you really think about it, they do. So we want to make sure we take this broad concept and realize that we can apply it in a lot of different ways, but there are different methods to make this easier for us in our teaching. So when we talk about inquiry-based learning, these are 4 concepts that were adapted from the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. And that's a really great resource. I recommend that you check it out. It's kind of more research-based in terms of how they came up with inquiry, not just for education, but for political science and other disciplines. But they identified 4 main concepts here. First, we have to ask good questions. And so we're going to start with the formation of a compelling question, a big question that's kind of going to be the highlight or title of our inquiry journey. And then we're going to have supporting questions that kind of get into the meat or the content that we want students to understand. So you can think of it as the overall stool with the legs or the umbrella and the support underneath, whatever metaphor you want to think about it, we've got to start with great questions. We also need to make sure that we're using the right tools and academic concepts to guide students through the inquiry process. So sometimes I think it's great that we ask big questions, but if we just allowed students to ask big theoretical questions, we'd probably be there all day and we've got content that we need to cover. So making sure that we're guiding them through the tools that we know how to use. We also need to make sure that students understand the academic concepts in terms of where they are. So we do need to assess formatively. So before we even get to the unit test or the project or whatever the end game is, we need to make sure that students are picking up on the questions and the answers throughout the way. So just as you would do in any other lesson or unit that you're doing, but that's really important here in inquiry, or we can go off track pretty easily. And then the last piece, which I think sometimes we rush through because we're just so excited we got through the end of the lesson. We as teachers and students also need to reflect on the problem, assess different options, and then take an informed action. And so a lot of times that looks like various education buzzwords, but we're going to break down what that actually means. It doesn't stop at the end of your unit test. We need to be thinking about that big question. It needs to have a life beyond that specific lesson. So I really want to talk about why we focused on inquiry as one of our global competency skills. And we thought it would be a great one to start off with because it is the first concept on the EdStep and Asia Society Global Competency Matrix that we like to use here at the World Affairs Council. So this resource is available on our Educator Resources webpage. You'll also get it in your folder later on. But when we try to define global competency here at the World Affairs Council, we like to do so in 4 main domains. And this inquiry skill falls really nicely within that first domain of investigate the world. So students need to know how to look at an issue, identify different pieces of information, analyze that information, and develop an argument. So how do I take in information and how do I make sense of that? Now, some of the other parts of this global competency domain we'll explore in future PD sessions here. So we're having monthly sessions throughout the academic year. So we've got recognizing perspectives, communicating ideas, and taking action. We'll see a little bit of that take action piece with the last step in the inquiry design model. So you'll get a little bit of that. And then I do want to make a plug later on for our February session about storytelling, because we're going to be exploring that communicate ideas aspect of the global competency matrix. So this is the framework from which we like to start. So why else should we be doing inquiry in the classroom? A lot of times we think of this, and we know in social studies in particular that the standards were made, the national standards, the NCSS standards, and a lot of times state standards. I know in Kentucky this is true. It was made with inquiry at the center, and there's really good reason for that. And I think that's applicable to other disciplines as well. And so these are kind of my top reasons why I think we should explore inquiry a little bit more often in the classroom. So obviously, yes, it does align well with state and national standards. So in social studies, those are the C3 standards. So college, career, and civic life. And really reinforcing that idea that if we're thinking about historians don't sit around and take multiple choice tests all day. They're really examining problems. They're taking big questions and putting them in a new light. They're using history to explain current events. And those are things that I think the standards have tried to adapt to. And sometimes we get overwhelmed with that, but we do need to realize it's a valuable skill. A lot of times in the AP courses, I taught AP histories, it aligns really well with what the AP exam has changed in terms of the writing skills. So it does align with those social studies standards. A lot of times it aligns with NGSS standards for science. So you can see a lot of overlap there. Right. One of my favorite reasons, though, is that it's an authentic activity. So when we talk about authenticity, we're really looking for things that we do in the classroom that mimic real life and the work that folks would do. And if you think about those of us who are outside of education and the research that we have to do for special projects at work, finding information and asking good questions, it's going to be key to any career. So we need to model that for students. Okay. I'm going to argue that it helps teachers frame curriculum and essential content topics, especially if you are a new teacher or you're a pre-service teacher in college or university. It's a really great framework for knowing what to teach and kind of asking that bigger so what question. And then lastly, it does allow for greater student voice. We've got the informed action piece that we're going to take at the end of the inquiry journey. And then sometimes in different questioning methods, we will allow students to ask the questions or students to rank which questions they think are important. So these are all really great ways to try some of these inquiry methods in your classroom. All right. So we're going to get into the inquiry design model here. And when we talk about IDM, there is a lot of research that went into this, and this overlaps really heavily with social studies and the C3 standards. The website where you're going to see a lot of this information is actually called C3 Teachers. So it's based on the research of Grant Swan and John Lee. I have attended a presentation by Dr. Kathy Swan, where she told us a little bit more of the behind the scenes of IDM. But this is a very specific model. And if you're getting started, this is a nice way to plan. But I'm going to argue later on that you don't have to do this all the time. So with the inquiry design model, there are essentially 3 phases, and this is a template that you'll get in your resource packet. First, we want to frame the inquiry. We want to decide what good questions we're going to ask. We're going to fill the inquiry with content and the resources that we want students to look at. And then we're going to finish by making connections, extensions, and taking informed action. So there are 3 specific phases that this model will go through. So the first phase is kind of the fun part here when we're thinking about this, and that's when we make our questions. So if you think back to your regular lesson plan or unit plan, you might start with content in mind, or kind of in the older days, we started with, students need to know XYZ standard, and we would put that as kind of the highlighter focus. And this kind of turns it on its head because we do need to look at the content, but we do also need to understand why that content is important to teach in the first place. So we need to ask big questions to kind of hook our students and then get them to discover the content that we want them to look at. So we're working with 2 different types of questions here. And so on one hand, we've got our big questions, and these are almost kind of the big overarching questions that guide your inquiry lesson or your unit. Sometimes we'll see compelling questions referred to as essential questions, but they really drive the conversation. If you're thinking about the newspaper, this is your headline. And there's a couple qualifications for those questions. They have to be what Dr. Swan calls intellectually meaty. So it has to be something that students can't just give a yes or no answer or just one specific answer and call it a day. And then it also has to be student friendly. So that means it's free from educational jargon and it's something that students would actually want to answer. So we can't overcomplicate this. We need to make it in kid-friendly language. And key thing here, it's going to allow for multiple answers. And a lot of times we see that and we get a little bit worried. But because you're using supporting questions as your crutch, you're going to guide students along the right path. So there's going to be some variation, but I don't want you to think there's going to be wildly different answers and we're going to debate this topic. So we're going to have the same path, end goal. We might take a different path to get there. Supporting questions are really what's going to drive the lesson in terms of content. So we think of these as our subheadings of the lesson. They make sure that we're on topic, we're focused, and these are really clean-cut answers. So if I ask what were some of the political goals of XYZ document, they should be able to find that. It's not as big, theoretical, intellectual as our compelling or essential question. So you're going to see those back and forth, and it's really important that we kind of decide which is which, and that we really think of compelling questions as something that can fit multiple different units and supporting questions that are specific to the unit that we're working on. All right, so I got a little task for you. I've got 8 questions up here, and as you read through those questions, I want you to just kind of make a mental note. Would that be a compelling or essential question, or would that be a supporting question? So I'll give you a couple minutes. And if you just want to make a mental note to yourself first, and then I'll ask for some volunteers to type in the chat here in a moment. I'm going to call out a couple different questions here. So if you take a look at number 1, is compromise always fair? If you think it's a compelling question, type a C for me. If you think it's a supporting question, type an S. Okay, good. So is compromise always fair? Can that apply to multiple different disciplines? Absolutely. Okay, so that's $1 million pie in the sky question. What about number 4, C or S? Can we find a specific answer for that? Or is that more theoretical? Yeah, now this one, after I put it in here, I started to have a little bit of doubts on myself. Depending on how we use it in the lesson, it could be an S, because if we go to the legal US definition of refugees versus asylum seekers, we can find an answer. If we're looking at how that definition has changed over time, that might be a little bit of a C. And Bill says exactly, I kind of went back and forth on here. Bill's also an inquiry expert. So I'm trusting Bill on this one. So we also have the power to kind of adapt these. If we're using number 8, that might be a supporting question because we could find that in the Green Cincinnati plan. So just kind of get a feel for what types of things might be compelling, what types of things might be supporting. And there might be a little bit of variation depending on how you're directing the lesson. There's always time for that. All right, thanks guys. So we're going to move on here to our next part of our inquiry journey, which is where we actually fill the inquiry. So we've got our pie in the sky question. We've got a question that's going to be relevant not just to this unit, but something else as well. We've got the direction that we want to go based on the content that I want to discuss later on, but I need to fill the inquiry. So I need to really think about what materials are going to allow my students to kind of answer the question in the direction that I'd like them to. So we're going to look at materials a little bit later on, but I think it's super important for inquiry that you're finding the right materials. So primary sources, maps, data pieces, whatnot. And then we also need to make sure with our supporting questions that we've got a way to check that students can answer that supporting question. So when we look at the template overall, we might have our inquiry journey take a couple days. But every day we might be focusing on a different supporting question. And how do I know that they've answered that one supporting question so that in the future, they're going to be able to answer that pie in the sky question? So think about the ways that you normally would assess student understanding, exit tickets, make a thesis statement of the day. But really, we have to drive home the fact that this is not your chapter test. So we need to check on students throughout the way. We have to do this in bite-sized chunks before they can tackle huge questions like that. And then when we look at phase 3 here, we have to finish the inquiry. So really, how do I build up the inquiry to make it something that's going to pique the student's interest? So if I go back to a question, is compromise always fair? And I'm talking about something like the Virginia plan in US history. Sorry, I've got US history on the brain. That might not be something that the students woke up and wanted to talk about today. But if they were talking about compromise related to a student issue in their high school, or compromise to something that was important to them personally, and I use that as a way to hook them in to that larger question that also has an academic focus, then that's what we're going for. So think about ways that you can have them address that essential question at first to kind of pique their interest and then kind of revisit it at the end of the lesson. So we'll see that a little bit later on. And then lastly, we have to make sure that we are extending and assessing this lesson appropriately. So we do need to have a summative test. So kind of think about your final assessment. When we are assessing in an inquiry, remember we started with a question. So we need students to answer that essential question. And how they answer that essential question is going to be different depending on the type of assessment that you use. The key thing that we have to realize is students do need to be able to construct an argument. And sometimes we look at that and say, oh man, we're writing an essay. It doesn't have to be. So when we think of students constructing an argument, they need to be able to answer that compelling question using evidence that you looked at throughout your inquiry journey and that fell underneath those little content umbrellas of the supporting questions. So for supporting questions, we're looking for kind of yes, no specific questions. And how do we get them to answer that compelling question in a way that is on focus, on task? So with this, there is also the piece of acknowledging competing views. And this might look a little bit different in terms of what your students do with this. your students might fill out a graphic organizer that does this. But that competing views is something that I really want you to think about, because there might be one specific way that they answer that question, but they need to also acknowledge that other people might try to answer that question a different way. And they need to be able to articulate why their answer may be better. And it might not be better as in right, but they have to be able to articulate why they made that specific argument. And I think that's important because when you go back to the AP history classes, I used to be a subject reader for AP US history. And if you taught any of the AP histories, there's the complexity point on the rubric. And I think a lot of people get afraid of that. But the students who got that point did this really well. They said, here's my thesis statement, but you know what? I also want to acknowledge that some people don't say this, but these are the reasons why I think my argument's better. And it's going to take students a while to get there, but practicing the skill with mini lessons in class gets them there in a much more structured way. So it is a really important task here. And then for the extension piece, we also need to come up with an alternative that also allows students to demonstrate mastery. So if you are completing a graphic organizer, maybe someone does this in a poster or visual form. Maybe someone does write a short paragraph. We've got to have multiple ways of getting at that argument versus just kind of one set routine way to go. All right, now the last pieces of the inquiry journey, we have to inspire students to take informed action. So it can't just be, we do a couple days on this particular topic and then we call it a day, because I had a question that was so meaty and engaging for students. I need to be able to show them that that can live in a lot of different places besides that specific unit. So with the informed action piece, I think a lot of times in social studies, we think if my students aren't writing letters to the governor, then they're not actually being civically engaged and we kind of missed the boat, or this is going to take a ton of time. And if you want to go that route, by all means, but we do need to have a way for students to understand that issue in a different context. So if I'm talking about the French Revolution, for example, and they construct an argument that these were the factors that contributed to the French Revolution, I might have them later on compare that to the revolutions in Latin America. Were those same factors at play? And does that same essential question apply to different circumstances? Or I might look at immigration trends in the United States and see, do those trends hold up in current day? So finding a new lens, maybe content that you need to focus on in your class anyway, maybe with current events, but we have to find ways that students can demonstrate agency. They've got to take ownership of it in a real world context. So some informed action pieces might be a student writing a little blurb about, if I were to contact my congressman, this is what I would like to hear about. Or maybe they find someone on TikTok who is an advocate for an issue on Indigenous rights, and they talk about how that person is using tactics that are similar to those that you examined in a lesson. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but it has to be something that, you know, students get a voice and they're able to connect that issue to something new. So that's what we mean by informed action. And then the last piece, which I think we get so excited that we finish that we forget about, we do need to take time to reflect, because if you're not used to this method, this is a lot of work that you put into this. So how did it turn out? So we have to look at our final piece of student work, that argument, and did they get close to the types of answers that I was anticipating that they would regarding that compelling question? So were there any differences? Were some students' answers a little bit more complex than others? Do I need to tweak that essential or supporting question in order to get at the same result next time? Those are things that we need to think about. Always think about if there are concepts that we need to reinforce later on and adjust our sources as needed. And then also the informed action piece. I think a lot of times we try to skip this, but it's really important to know what our students are interested in. So a lot of times they'll teach you things and they'll show you different resources and videos that they find that are fascinating that you can use in your classroom. So don't miss the opportunity to learn a little bit more about your students in that way. All right. So we're going to take a look at a couple different lessons to kind of get a sense of how you would see IDM in action. So we're going to look at one lesson that is about global modernization from C3 teachers, and this follows IDM to a T. They're using the same templates, blueprints, whatnot. And then we're also going to look at a lesson from a colleague of mine about the Armenian genocide, where she uses inquiry, but she's not necessarily following the IDM specifically. So what I'm going to pull up here is the C3 teachers website, and I'm just going to adjust this so you can see a little bit more. Great. So on C3 teachers, and you'll get this in your resource packet. This is one of the best websites, particularly for social studies teachers and humanities teachers, to use IDM in a way that's already been created. So when we look at this one, this is about modernization. And we'll see that I can download the unit plan. I'm going to suggest that you do that later on to kind of get into the nitty gritty of what this lesson is about. But we're going to look for the components here. So in this lesson, what's the compelling question? Does development mean progress? Is that something that's debatable? Yeah. Okay, so we don't have a nice, easy yes or no question. They're going to stage the question. So it talks about here that they're using the United Nations Human Development Index as kind of their source for defining development and progress. Remember, we've got to stage the question, because if we just let students run loose with this, we would go in a lot of different directions. Okay. Using that template, they have 3 supporting questions. And so that might mean they might explore a different supporting question on a different day. They might do 2 in one day, 1 in the other, different ways that you can actually attack this. But notice this one's pretty simple. They ask the same supporting question each day, but they're using a different country. So they're asking what are the impacts of development in Kenya? What are the impacts in Botswana? What are the impacts in Algeria? So different ways of getting at that information. This can be really comparative. We have to make sure that they're doing a task that shows that they understood Kenya before we get back to this pie in the sky compelling question. So in this one, they're writing a 1-page research summary that talks about HDI rank, life expectancy, and other factors. So that's their kind of check-in. They've got the sources that they're going to use. Right? And when we get back to that essential question, now that they've got 3 countries, what are they going to do? They're going to construct their argument. So does development mean progress? Use your assigned African country or all 3 countries, construct an argument that addresses the compelling questions, uses specific claims and relevant evidence. Now, how they do that, if we click into this PDF document here, it'll talk about, whether they're writing an essay or whatnot, and it'll also have the specific sources and the template that they use for the formative task for each day and the sources that they use each day. Also, how they're taking action at the end of this. So if you look into the nitty gritty of how it works, you can see that there are a lot of different ways to go. But if you're trying the IDM method, or your department uses the IDM method, this is a really good website to start with, because the inquiries were built already. And some states also have reciprocal agreements where it already meets the standards. So for example, in Kentucky, there are some IDM lessons on here that were built specifically for Kentucky schools. And so with this one, I think it was built specifically for New York and their standards, but a lot of times they overlap. Oh, great. Bill has a really good question. At which age range do you see this best being implemented? I would say a lot of this inquiry where we're getting to making an argument and taking informed action. A lot of this is high school, middle school level. I'm going to introduce a different technique that I think we could do as a precursor to the inquiry design model, because a lot of times if we're not used to doing this, this seems overwhelming. And building those different skills of asking good questions, finding good answers, ranking our questions, and then getting to the argument a little bit later on. So notice this one is going to be 10th grade. And I would really say kind of sophomores and up would excel in IDM, but there are some folks that do this with kind of upper elementary kids, like 6th and 7th and 8th grade. So it depends. You can model your questions and make them a little bit more student friendly at younger ages, but I see a lot of this kind of at a high school level. And we're going to look at another lesson. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a brain break here. And this one is actually by a friend of mine. Her name is Amy Perkins, and she was one of the top teachers of the year. So the Transatlantic Outreach Program does a program where teachers can study abroad in Germany. And so Amy and I actually met on another study tour to Japan. And so she wrote this lesson on the Armenian Genocide. And she uses an inquiry-based approach, but she doesn't follow IDM specifically. But I want you to try to see if you can find the components of IDM within her lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and type this in the chat if you want to take a look at this. While you just kind of glance through, some of the things that I want you to look for are the questions that she uses. So she calls it the driving question. That's essentially the compelling question or essential question. Think of your $1 million question. The supporting questions that she uses, what she's actually teaching, so her objectives, what she does in class. So does she do a gallery walk? What methods is she using? And then how does she extend this lesson? So we're going to do kind of a minute or two glance over of this lesson. And if you would be so kind, tell me what you like about this lesson and how you think it differs from kind of the IDM-based approach that we just saw. All right, so you guys had a lot of different responses here. So a lot of different things that we liked. So the methods and activities that she used, some of the sources and materials that she used, and then the extension opportunities. And one of the things that I also wanted to point out, her supporting questions here are still pretty broad. So when she says, what is genocide and why is this term so hotly contested? Yeah, absolutely. I did talk to Amy the other day, so please feel free to share. She has this one published and she has another one published with Top Germany, so do feel free to share. So the supporting questions still allow for some wiggle room, and that's okay, but they should be more content focused than that driving question. That driving question, if a student tried to Google it, they would be on a wide old goose chase. And so we have to reinforce the difference between those. So, and one thing that I do like that she does is she looked at the extension opportunities, and I think sometimes we skip that. But there are different ways that she can compare that to what's going on with talks about race in the United States, Native American issues, and there are different current events that she brought up as well. So when we're thinking of like extensions and informed action, there are different ways that you can do that. And it doesn't have to be like with the IDM blueprint, but this does have a lot of the same components of IDM. So that's why I wanted to show it to you. All right, so thank you for taking a look at that with me. I do want to go back to another inquiry or question-based topic that I think is going to be important in our classroom. And this is kind of our approach to inquiry. So one thing that I did want to throw in here that we can have another discussion about, how hands-on do my students need to be in all of this? And so there are some approaches that say, you know, kind of like IDM showed us, the teacher can provide resources one by one for student examination. Teachers can provide that supporting question, and students are going to be on a set path. As long as there's variation within that path, I think that's a good, healthy way to be. Some of us might be ready to turn it up a couple notches and let students have a go at it. And some of us are terrified to do that. So there might be times where students work from a set of resources that you give them and they identify the direction in which they take. That might be more of a unit approach or a project-based approach, or they could identify their own supporting questions. I see this a lot in science classes. A lot of times in the AP sciences, they use a method that's called POGLE, and I think it's process-oriented guided inquiry learning. And if they're doing an experiment, sometimes it does make sense for them to ask their own questions, test their own hypotheses, things like that. So I put that in there as something to think about. If you want to graduate to more of a guided versus direct, there might be some opportunities where that makes sense for you. And, when students are young or depending on their level, you might want to be more direct. So there's a lot of variation within these approaches too. All right. So I wanted to share another method of questioning that is not IDM, but I think is also important. And Bill and I had talked about this before. And that is from the Right Question Institute. And they have a really good book that is called Make Just One Change. And it's really about the kind of metacognitive research behind this method. And it's all about formulating the correct questions and kind of narrowing your focus and making sure that you're doing a needs assessment. And so this organization works a lot with educators now, but they also work with public policy institutions and social services to get people to ask better questions and advocate for themselves. So think about, when the government needs to do appropriation of the budget towards social services, how do you evaluate if those social services are doing their job? You've got to ask the right questions. And that's really the research behind that. So if you have an Amazon wish list, I highly recommend that you take a look at that book if you want to learn a little bit more about this technique. But this is a resource that they provide that's called Question Formulation Technique on One Slide. So in IDM, we have a very structured approach. In question formulation technique, I'm really question-centered here. I want to spark student interest, and I want them to start to realize what questions are going to be most appropriate. So a lot of times, we've got a couple strategies that we would do. We've got a question focus. We write down as many questions as we can in response to a resource. And then we kind of go back and then we do two things to those questions. We define what type of question it was that I came up with, and then I rank what questions are going to be most important to me. So when we get to improving our questions, I'm going to identify what's an open-ended question and what's a closed-ended question. So closed-ended, we get a nice yes or no or one-word answer. Open-ended, it's going to take some digging. So we identify the question type, we strategize which ones might be more important to us, and then we kind of reflect and come up with a game plan. So this resource is going to be in your folder, but let me show you what this might look like with a stimulus like a map. So I like to do this with maps and data because I think a lot of times we assume that students know how to read a map or look at data, but say I was doing a lesson on the impacts of carbon and I showed students this map. And so I am on National Geographic Mapmaker. Anybody ever use Mapmaker? You can put a yes in the chat. I love this resource and there's a lot for students to play with. So I'm looking at the global human footprint, and if I zoom in on this map, I want students to write down as many questions as they can based on what they see. And that might inform a bigger discussion about climate change and the ways that humans impact climate change. So if I go back here, I just wrote some theoreticals on the types of questions that students might come up with. So if you take a look at some of those questions, what questions in this list do you think might be closed-ended questions. What's something that I could probably find a nice, quick, easy answer to? I'll give you a minute to take a look at that. So again, this is kind of theoretical, but I could maybe look at, if I was looking at number 8, what's the most populated city in the United States? I could probably find that answer. But with maps, one of the things that I found is you get a lot of open-ended questions that you can research a little bit more. So I would first identify what questions are open-ended, require some more exploration, which ones are closed. I could probably find a quick, easy answer to. And then next step here is I might need to prioritize what questions I think are going to be important. So say here, if I liked questions 4 and 5, do cities always have the highest human footprint level? And how quickly did the US get to this point? That might be a question or two that I could research on my own. And one of the nice things I like about MapMaker is you can allow students to explore these questions. So if I go to MapMaker, I can see different things that I can add to the layer. So here's my global footprint layer. And see, I turned that red again. But I can also look at things like light pollution or anything that I think is going to get me closer to that answer. So if there's ever an opportunity where you really want students to explore something deeper or kind of have a focus, maybe at the beginning of a unit, you do this as a way to drive curiosity and remind students that, hey, they came up with a question that I, as a teacher, thought was important, and let's see if we can solve that together. I do think that that's something that's valuable. I've done this with primary sources. One that went particularly well was the integration of Little Rock High School, where she's going to school and, you know, the angry mom is behind her. And the students asked really good questions. And I thought that was a photo that everyone would recognize, but really when they ask, you know, what did she do that elicited such a great response? And the answer was, you know, she went to school in a time of segregation. That is really something that piques their interest and kind of asks broader questions that they can revisit later on in the unit. So that's a technique that I recommend exploring a little bit more with your resources in the folder. But I do want to take a look at some sources because I know we're a little bit limited on time here. So you will get the folder with resources. And so I do want to copy and paste the link here if you wanted to take a look. I'll probably be adding things as I think of them based on the conversation we had today, but you will get this folder. And I did want to launch a quick little poll here before we go. When it comes to sources, what's the most important for you to think about when you're looking for sources? So if you're most interested in finding quality articles, primary sources, images, what's most important to you to find when you're on the lookout for things to enhance your lesson? All right, I'm seeing a lot of things about quality articles with content, so not relying on that textbook. Images that pique student interest, super important there. Unique perspectives, things that you can adapt, all really important things to be on the lookout for. So this will all be in your folder, and I've got a list of things that I really like, but I wanted to highlight a couple here. There are some resources that do a really good job of compiling essential questions. And sometimes we just need a approach to something to make it more applicable to students. So why are we learning about the French Revolution? Why am I learning about the Nixon Doctrine? And I think the Gilder Lehrman Institute does a good job of this. There is a document in your folder where they have, it's over 100 essential questions for US history and kind of international relations. And so I recommend you check that out if you teach social studies. And then Teach Thought and Future Focused Learning also have two big, several hundred question guides of essential questions that have different subject areas. So there's English, there are interdisciplinary topics, there are social justice topics in there. So I recommend that you check those out and see if what you're teaching kind of fits under the umbrella of some of those essential questions. So take a look at those resources. Some of my favorites for using the question formulation technique and the inquiry design model, Right Question Institute that we referred to earlier, they have several articles about how to use question formulation technique, and I know we glanced over it today, but you can use it in math classes. There are blogs about how teachers have done this, so check them out. C3 Teachers that we saw the modernization lesson on, and then I mess up my top logo, the Transatlantic Outreach Program or the Goethe Institute. They have a great series comparing the United States with Germany. They're also the group that does the free educator study tour to Germany. They have redone theirs to match inquiry. And then Bill also mentioned states are now developing inquiry hubs, including Ohio. Absolutely. So I will get Ohio's and put it on the list. It's an editable Google Doc. But I do have Jefferson County Public Schools there in Kentucky, and they do a really nice job of it. So be on the lookout for your state's hub as well. And then sometimes when it comes to finding sources and materials, we just have to have something that inspires or sparks an interest. And so especially for question formulation technique, when we want students to have as many questions as possible and then rank them, some of my favorites are up here, but don't underestimate the power of images, because there's a lot of questions that you might have on an image and it uncovers the content that you eventually need to cover. So I really like the New York Times and National Geographic's photos of the day. So if you take a look at that, usually there are good things on there. And for maps, I love National Geographic Mapmaker Interactive. I can't say enough things on it. And then some of my favorite places for primary sources and global issues. With primary sources, Gilder Lehrman and Shag Reading Like a Historian. I know in social studies, we use these a lot. But a lot of times these are go-to places where if I'm looking for something that's adapted to the student reading level, that's the first thing I will check, is likely Shag and then Gilder Lehrman, then Teaching American History. So social studies folks, there are a lot of good resources there if you're looking for historical primary sources. All right. I know I took a lot of your time today and we're just over time, but I did want to give a big thank you for all of you who attended. This is the first webinar teacher training we've done in a while, and we're so glad to have you here. Great. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me. We appreciate you being a friend of the World Affairs Council. I hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon.